So we tried to move the seminars around so you can't find them. No, we were in the lecture theatre last week, but we're back in the atmosphere. So following on from Jim Watson, we heard last week speaking on energy policy, and in a talk postponed from last term, we're going to hear from John Barrett. We're very pleased to invite down. Now, I have on this paper that he's going to be talking about positive low energy futures, energy demand reduction options now. So I'll have to read what it says here. Snappier title, role of energy demand reduction in achieving net zero in the UK. The overlooked part, I've just come from a future energy scenarios discussion, which always talks about doing more things. But hey, what if we just did less? Good work, couldn't it? So John, as I'm sure you all know, could introduce him much more effectively than I can. He is a professor in energy and climate policy at the University of Leeds, and of course, co-director of CRES, and has worked very closely with people here and in other institutions on one of the largest of the themes, that's the technical term within CRES. And it's really a comprehensive national vision about how focus on demand can help deliver net zero. John has advised a number of government select committees, departments and agencies such as the Committee on Climate Change. And his excuse for not coming last time was simply not good enough. He was being awarded an OBE for his efforts in this area. So I think in terms of climate policy and resource efficiency, it's great to have John come and join us. It's really good of him to do that. And just to say, I think we're in a very tight situation with the grid, having a cold and also still period. And let's unearth some of the things that benefit from a focus on demand reduction. So, John, over to you to talk about a positive future.
Thanks, Robin. Thank you. You should wait you've heard the talk before you do this. It isn't quick, just thank you very much. So, yeah, great. And great to be here. And obviously, great to be at the home of CRES, which has been a fantastic sort of institution for the last 5 years. And I think has really brought together lots of the energy demand researchers in the UK. And in part, this project that I'm going to talk to you about was all about, in essence, trying to bring those communities together to try and create what is a comprehensive vision of how energy demand can contribute to our net zero goals and our targets. So I thought I'd start just by reminding us all what our net zero ambitions and our targets actually are. And obviously this is proposed by the Climate Change Committee and then adopted by government as a target in budgetary periods of about sort of 5 years, and with the aim of getting emissions to net zero by 2050. Now, I despise the word net in this because it's the biggest get out clause that you can have of any accounting system. And if everyone could have a sort of a net approach to their bank account, we'd all be a lot better off than we are now have rather large budgets, because at some point in the future we're going to put the bank account right, but just not at the moment. So we very clearly propose, in essence, or the way I sort of see it in reality, is that we need emissions to be as low as they possibly can be as quickly as possible. And then any of the negative bit really for me is more about climate balancing and balancing emissions at a later point. But this is what the CCC have recommended in their balanced pathway that we should achieve. And it just dips below zero. You can't quite see it at 2050, but it's pretty much a path to zero emissions over that time period. And what I've done here is I've cumulatively added up what the emissions would be in the different decades. And the reason I've done this is because I think sometimes we forget how sharp the reduction needs to be in those last 10 years between 2040 and 2050. So if we cumulatively add up all the emissions that we'd be allowed to release over that decade, they would be the same as emissions were last year in the UK. So those last 10 years are not really a time for major innovation. It's not a time to suddenly bring about enormous change. That's got to happen earlier on. And it's those residual emissions in those last 10 years that we're trying to clear up. So the average yearly emissions for those last 10 would be 48 million tonnes a year. So that's incredibly low. Emissions this year, it's around the 500-ish mark, just to put that in perspective. We also front-loaded our that it takes time, so we need to have slightly higher budgets at the beginning. So what that creates then is a sharper curve to reduce them quicker. So the total cumulative emissions, obviously, over this period to the next one, more than halves over that time period. So therefore, the reality is that we don't really have 2050 to do this. We, in essence, have, I'd say, 2040, if not earlier, to have the vast majority of the reduction done by that point. So if we actually want to follow that pathway, which also a discussion I wasn't planning to get into, lots would say isn't fast enough and isn't aligned with global IPCC pathways, or at least the pathways that the IPCC bring together and present. Putting that issue aside, we'd like to do this even earlier if we could. And Chris Stark, the head of CCC, says that if we could do it earlier, wouldn't that be fantastic? But this is their pathway in line with the statutory requirements under the Climate Change Act and what they propose. So if we take that seriously, that we've really got to do this well before 2040 and 2040 at the latest, then that limits our options in what we've got to do. One, I think, is that we basically means that the technologies we have available are the ones that we already know. There isn't going to be a miracle in that time period. I presented a similar presentation. I was only given 12 minutes, though, in Parliament last week. And the first question after presenting energy demand reduction was on fusion. Yeah, everything. That says everything to you. And I reckon I was given 100 reasons why you can't retrofit a home, but an incredibly positive outlook on fusion and why it's going to solve all problems. But if we take these budgets seriously, then we can simply forget about that debate. So we have the technologies we have now. They must be in the marketplace already, and they've probably taken over at least a few % of the market at this point. The next thing I think we need to recognise is this needs to be non-linear change. We're not just going to be able to gently persuade a paradigm shift as one gradually takes over the other, and therefore this change needs to happen sharper and it must reflect more than historical growth. The next one would be is that up to 2040, engineered removal solutions are not going to play a significant role at all in this goal. That's not being negative about those emissions. It's in essence just being real about the take up of technologies and the speed that they can be developed. And finally, then, I suppose it shows us that a focus on energy demand is really important because it's the overall size of the energy system which determines, in essence, the speed of change and the ability for renewables to increase at rate. So I suppose to summarise, this really gives us three broad options to help meet this target. One is decarbonisation, and the second one would be to remove carbon, which I think we can argue would have a limited role by that time period. And finally, it's to reduce our energy demand. On the first one, I think we're often raved about how well the UK is doing in decarbonising the power grid, and it's a partial success, I think, to UK. That we're reaching 50% plus renewables on the grid, but a reminder that electricity is about 20–25% of all our energy use in the UK. And in the media, they constantly miss the point that energy and electricity are not the same thing. And 75%-ish, maybe a little bit more, is coming from other sources, which is pretty much entirely fossil fuels. So in reality, then, it is the demand side, which in essence has been most underexplored. Now, we could have a discussion to some extent as to why that's been the case, but I think one, I suppose, for me, very briefly, it touches on all of our lives. There's a lot of individual stakeholders involved in that. We're not trying to sort of address 5, 6 key major sources. We, in essence, have distributed across 20 million, 25 million households. I think also there's this notion that if we start to actually affect the way that people might live, that we are sort of part of some sort of nanny state that isn't allowed to tell people what to do, despite having loads of policies which encourage people exactly what to do in a whole range of areas of consumption, aviation in that group. If we make it cheap, then people might do something. And then I suppose another key point for me is this old link that if we reduce demand, now I think collectively it's meant that energy demand has been underrepresented in policy and underrepresented in terms of what it could do to help achieve those goals. And I'm sure lots of other people could add to that list or slightly refine them or describe it in a slightly different way, but I've tried to do it in 1 minute. So what did we do? Brought together 17 researchers in Creds and a couple here as well today to try and understand collectively how much energy demand could come down under a coherent vision of the future. And to do this, we tried to maintain a few key elements. One, we started with a complete sort of scenario narrative of the future, and we developed really a framework that tried to comprehensively, I suppose, estimate demand, but alongside supply side changes. We then used a whole range of sector level models because we didn't want to lose the specificity that they offer and that real specific detail into quite how many houses could we retrofit, or how much can we switch behaviours or practices within mobility, what sort of dietary changes are possible, what can we expect from industry, and so on. So we relied on the models which have that specificity and detail at sector level. We then brought these together to understand the interlinkages, and I've got an example of that in a minute. And then we brought them into one central modelling system, and this work was done with our colleagues at UCL and brought it into the UK Times system to understand, therefore, its interaction with supply side. And I think this whole system perspective is really crucial because it captures the linkages and trade-offs between sectors and helps ensure consistency based on a sort of chosen scenario narrative. And this gave us 4 scenarios, which had completely different names about 2 weeks before it was published. And then someone who knows how to name things better, and did mainly Hannah, came up with our 4 different scenarios. Ignore, in essence, we could generally ignore energy demand as a policy option. Steer it in the right direction, which involves, in essence, keeping the same level of energy service demands, but providing them more efficiently. Shift, which is a substantial shift in our use of energy, but also in our practices, or completely transform our use of energy while trying to improve quality of life in a whole range of key areas. So here are the results in terms of energy demand reduction. If we decide to ignore energy demand as an option, we're proposing that we'll have about 5% reduction in energy demands from about 2015 up to 2050. I do not take the pandemic into account. So potentially there's some revisions that can be done there. But the top line scenario is consistent with the Climate Change Committee's kind of almost known policy scenario. So this means implementing the policies which have a clear framework and are being introduced. It doesn't mean we'd like to put 600,000 heat pumps in homes every single year. That's not a policy that at the moment we describe as an ambition. So there's a huge debate, and we had that huge debate about what is a policy and what's an ambition and a strategy. This is known policies with a clear delivery plan. As I say, the CCC have a similar pathway, and so do BAIS. And in essence, it'll come down by about 5%, and it could be marginally higher, but we're not seeing a transformative change at that point. Our 3 scenarios, which all tried to reduce it, this wasn't on purpose, but came up with around 30, 40 and 50%. That was honestly the answer. There's no massaging that's gone on with them, varying levels of ambition. And I'll run through, in essence, what we try to cover and achieve under those. But just to sort of focus on the transform scenario, this one also proved to be roughly consistent with the global analysis done by IASA, led by Grubler, and paper in Nature Energy, and then we also published this in Nature Energy. It's global. It was consistent with these global energy demand scenarios, which now form one of the four main pathways identified within the IPCC's latest assessment. But the main purpose of come to just in our transform one with the halving energy demand in essence by 2050 is that we also identify within the scenario numerous sort of benefits, health benefits, improved local environments, improved work practices, reduced investment needs, and also lower cumulative emissions in the early years. So we also noted that the scenario demands, it was also a positive vision for what's possible. And I think as a community, we've got an important role to do in showing what the world could be like and that it could be better, as opposed to just saying that everything else is wrong. And it's important to say that things are wrong, but it's also important then to have an answer of what it could look like and a positive vision of what that could be. So I think we counted up in the end that we had over 700 interventions captured across a whole scenario. So I'm not going to go into each individual intervention, but you'll notice a rather chunky supplementary information in the paper, which I'll give you at the end, and also the website where we have even further detail. We ended up publishing papers on the sector level results as well as the overall results. But just to sort of give you sort of an insight of where we went with it, the scenarios in essence tried to stick originally to the idea put forward by Felix Kreutzig, which was then used in IPCC to frame demand around the possibility to improve the efficiency, but not affect energy services, to shift potentially in the same service delivered, but in a different way. So I can get a car to a train or car to walking would be a good example there. And then also try and avoid unnecessary energy demands, which in essence doesn't overly affect the actual quality of life associated with it. So I suppose that could be heating a room in a house which you're not even using, or it could actually be activities which give us very little pleasure, like driving long distances to go to the shop, and we'd actually prefer to walk around the corner. So reducing our need to travel would be a good example there as well. So we encompassed all of those across all the different sectors, looking at everything from installation options to improving the efficiency of producing products, to also then huge switches in new technologies, a lot of electrification to vehicles, heating, for example, but also more systemic change with shifts in public transport, but also considerably lower meat use, increase in plant-based diets, circular economy options within industry. So it's a wide-ranging area. And what you'll see is quite a substantial reduction. So there's over a 50% reduction in every sector except for industry. I'll explain why in a second. And in reality, we're able to achieve well above 50% reduction in some key sectors. Transport's got the largest reduction here. I would say that's probably partly down to Christian, obviously here, who was probably the most ambitious out of all the modelers. So we tried to be consistent, but in reality, I felt we probably could have pushed it a bit further in another couple of areas. There's another scenario effort which we've been supporting across a whole range of European institutions, which are looking, whose analysis came out at 58%, which they published about a week ago. So potentially there's even more available there. So this graph shows, again, the reduction across these sectors, but we've made a rather crude distinction, which I'm never that crazy on, but we made that distinction just to give you an idea of whether it's an efficiency improvement. So that might be switch to electric vehicles, for example, or whether it was something to do more with broader social change to reduce the distance of travel, more compact cities, or the food, reducing the need, reducing calorific intake, for example, would be social change as opposed to an efficiency change. So we've made this crude distinction just to show the point almost that it's not one or the other. It is when we add both together that we get the transformative change. that we need. And this varies, but not significantly across all sectors, except for industry, again, which we call material products. And that's partly because we've exploited many of the energy efficiency options already within industry, leaving us with a smaller number of options available. So, for example, in steel making, traditionally, the energy costs could be a third of their total output, a third of their total costs associated with production. So it's not surprising that they do it at a reasonable level of efficiency and that we don't have a sort of massive efficiency option just waiting there to do that. With steel, for example, it's more likely to be hydrogen will be the key technology that plays a role, and which obviously is outside the scope of our work because it's energy demand. So let's see how these scenarios. You might remember which have sort of 5% reduction off this chart, and the reason for that is that in essence it falls well short of our government targets and our goals. It would result in emissions around 390 million tonnes by 2050, so it's completely inconsistent. And so that's the current pathway scenario for the UK. So here are the three scenarios. 2 out of 3 met the net zero and all of the carbon budgets in place, but they did it quite differently. This one did not make it. You'll see a gap here of 29 million tonnes. It falls short, and it also has a significant reliance on engineered removal technologies. If you look at the CCC's sort of scenario, which is most similar to this, they don't have a shortfall, but they imply an increased amount of direct air capture within it to meet it. But with those certain constraints on sustainable biomass availability and cost and uptake of those technologies, others can interpret those differently. So you could argue that you would need negative emissions in the region of around 75 million tonnes under this scenario. Our assumptions just assume that it falls short based on the assumptions around what I've just described. The shift scenario, which represented about a 40% reduction in emissions, achieves the goal, but still has quite a heavy reliance on engineered or negative emission technologies in the region of just under 60 million tonnes each year. And it is the transform scenario, mainly a 52% reduction, which leaves residual emissions in the region of around 45 million tonnes. And my feeling is that we don't get down to around the 45 million tonne mark, we're leaving too much to be done on the negative emission side within this time frame. And what is shown in this transform scenario as well is that it reduces or pretty much gets rid of the reliance on engineered removal technologies, which is also consistent with the global study that Grubler presented. These reductions are nature-based solutions in terms of emission reductions. Now, you can also be equally sceptical about the ability to deliver those in reality, and I know we could have a discussion about that, but I'll try and remain focused on energy demand. And I think what we clearly see here is that if we don't get 40% reductions, then in essence, it's almost impossible to achieve it. Even at 50% reductions, we're still leaving quite a lot, but we're leaving considerably less. So it's a lower risk option out of all of them. So in reality, we would suggest that if the government doesn't have a clear strategy of 40, 50% or even higher of energy demand reduction, that it will fail to meet its net zero objectives. I wanted to return to a couple of sectors a bit more specifically, just as the industry one around materials and products, and just why didn't it achieve its emission reduction to the same extent. And it's partly because we pushed forward very radical proposals around resource efficiency improvements, but those resource efficiency improvements don't reduce emissions inside the UK so much. They reduce them outside the UK because we import a considerable large proportion of that. So within this, we both have so here is our kind of ignore scenario from a production perspective, i.e. the emissions inside the UK. And from this perspective, we in essence find that the emissions will not go down much by 2050. And our emissions from a consumption perspective, which take it, and these are the same, they're just a different way of splitting it up, they in essence would still be over around 730 million tonnes in the UK. They're currently around the 800 million mark. And that, in essence, from consumption is the emissions, taking the UK emissions, extracting the emissions embodied in exports and adding on the emissions embodied in imports. It's slightly more complicated than that, but that's pretty much what it is. And as you can see, we have a huge reliance on imports for those. So the energy demand reduction was less from that because we're actually affecting it outside, and we apply a kind of domestic territorial production. But the point being that there are increased benefits to emission and reduction in energy demands outside the UK from UK action and UK policy. So we used our multi-vision output model that we developed at Leeds to, in essence, track the emissions to the final use stage, and then we're able to model reduction circular economy mechanisms and techniques. That might be through material substitution for less carbon intensive products, to product longevity, removing of technological obsolescence, through to actually questioning whether we really need the product in the first place at a more fundamental level. And as you can see, while in some areas in the UK, if we affect and reduce our emissions from transport and electricity use and so on, we will get most of the reduction in the UK. In other areas, over 90% of the embodied emissions associated with the UK are happening outside. So we did have policies to reduce fast fashion impact and so on, but there's no impact or very little impact in the UK as such. So these were the kind of, just to give you an idea, we also did, using the same model, quite a sort of scenario on food, which addressed a number of key areas. One, efficiency options within agriculture, which were reasonably limited. One thing that we lacked, which potentially is a game changer, was lab-based meat. And we tried to incorporate that at some level in the follow-on work that we've been doing with the Government Office of Science. But this is mainly the reduction from a huge shift to plant-based diets and also reduction in calorific intake. So on average, we're our calorific intake in the UK is about 25% higher than it should be. And then in terms of the material ones, these are the kind of product areas where we were looking. Shifts from goods to services, for example, would cover the reduction in individual private car ownership, moving to more shared models. So that's where we've linked up with other scenarios. But just to give you another sort of sector level sort of detail, the kinds of changes that we looked at. Just so I mentioned transport as well, because Christian did this, and I thought, leave it Oxford if you have to recognise that. So here we can see close to 80% of trips currently by car, and then this switches quite significantly, where 50% as the driver or passenger going down to 16%, sharing, increasing car occupancy, and then also you'll see quite substantial increases in a whole range of walking, cycling and mobility. Now, this change is quite extreme from where we are. So we're not pretending that we've done something which says, the government hasn't turned around to us and we presented and said, oh, thank you. Brilliant. Now we know what to do. They look at it and say, that's impossible. But if this is impossible, then what is possible? And what is the answer? And my feeling is that's not the clarity that we're getting at the moment. If we don't do this kind of switch and change, then we're relying on technologies which are completely unproven at scale. This is not unproven at scale. Most of our case studies or the interventions that we've done, they exist somewhere and they are working and they are functioning. And they involve, in essence, improving the quality of life. They involve significantly transforming the role of city centres into more cultural centres and where people work, live, play, etc. It's quite a fundamental shift, but it's not something which does not exist anywhere. This is not some sort of radical vision where we need to sort of of some utopia. It's an extension of what we know works in a short timescale, which doesn't need major technological breakthrough and innovation. I mentioned briefly that we looked at all the interlinkages. So this took a long time to do this, but we tried to identify all of the potential crossovers and interrelationships between sectors. So, for example, we reduced house building quite considerably, partly by converting lots of unused offices and retail spaces into high density living. And that, in essence, then reduced the amount of construction needed, and that reduced the embodied energy from industry and nutrition. We freed up a lot of land, enormous amount of land used for pasture in the UK or for the growing of crops that we feed to animals. We then free that up to increase our nature-based solution options and the management of that land. So these are just a few, but there are hundreds of interconnections that we explored to try and give a complete, consistent overview. So the next thing I'll briefly look at then is how all of this potentially would affect the electricity reduction, of course, is that we can moderate the size of the system that needs to be introduced. So you remember in the sphere scenario, which is about 30% reduction, is mainly done through efficiency. But even under this system, the electricity system would need to, 2.5 times bigger than it is today by 2050. And that's quite expensive as well. And this needs to be, we talk about energy demand needing kind of public buy-in and support, but this needs significant public buy-in and support as well, because this is a fundamental change into how we would see energy and how electricity would be produced. In our next scenario, we in essence potentially about double it, but we really moderate the size of that increase in the transform scenario quite significantly and really help to sort of moderate the size and scale of the system. And so this is a significant reduction needed in the investment costs associated with it. Now, of course, there are investment costs associated with the energy demand, but overall, there are significant savings associated with it. I put the number in the report and I forgot to put it on my slide. So I won't say the number because I might be wrong. I had 70 billion in my head as the savings, but I can't quite remember and verify that. But I'll look it up and find it if the question comes that way. The other potential option that energy demand gives us, and I sort of mentioned at the beginning that if we could, we would have speed up this transition even more than what the CCC outlines within its balanced scenario. And that is in essence to increase our climate ambition. So we ran a scenario, and we called it Transform CB, Transform Climate Carbon Budget, which in essence is a 25% lower allocation to the UK. And that's based on a more egalitarian equal distribution of the global remaining carbon budget, in line with, I suppose, the idea of common but differentiated responsibility. And it is only when we are getting energy demand reductions in the region of 50% that we could actually even consider really increasing the ambition of climate targets in that time period. It offers a pathway which could be achieved without considerable cost, but a faster transformation and changes in sort of social practices. Oh, hi, Christian. I've mentioned you a couple of times in here, so it was all good. Yeah.
I thought Transform CB was Transform Christian Brands.
Ah, yeah. I just realised we named it now. Not carbon budgets, no. Yeah, great. So I just now want to sort of move on from our results to reflect on policies, and Nick and myself, with a few others as well, started to think about that and put forward a paper this year to try and start thinking about what it might mean and the implications of policy for this scale of change. And what we haven't done is we haven't come up with a complete policy package and carried out some sort of marginal abatement cost curve and said it's nice and cheap, because I just don't think that's the way to do it anyway. But we've come up with, I think, some ideas on what this looks like and the kind of scale of change which we might sort of need and where it might happen. So firstly is a quite obvious thing probably to most people in the room, but this isn't a technology versus sort of social change agenda. We roughly got about half our reductions from improvements in energy efficiency and another half from around broader social changes. It's only together that we really can create transformative change. So there's no either or here within a policy context. This also requires changing the system, and by that I mean it's a complex problem which I suppose changes or affects potentially industrial structures, it changes economics, it changes social practices, it changes technologies, it changes our skills, and the workforce may be orientated. So therefore, it requires that sort of transformative change, recognising that this isn't just a conventional sort of linear economics answer to the problem. And really something where we just say, oh, we can put a carbon price in and this will happen, is an entirely inadequate response to such a complex problem. We also note as well that there is quite significant electrification in our scenarios, and therefore it goes hand in hand with the switches in the power sector, and also actually enables those changes to happen at greater speeds by moderating the speed of change that's needed. So it's not that difficult to understand why there's no silver bullet to solve this problem. It affects, in essence, the way that we eat, move, heat our homes and the products we buy. So we're not going to have one big solution and just set a carbon price and everything's great. But there are a few things to learn, and one is that I think while we might want to be, or there's this sense of wanting to be agnostic about which technologies win through, we also need to be realistic about those timeframes. And we can't pretend that we're going to have a hydrogen boiler anymore in our home. We need to recognise that it is going to come from heat pumps. Now, there'll be some specific locations, which I'm sure the media will find, where it doesn't work. But the reality is that heat pumps will be the technology. The reality is that it won't be a hydrogen vehicle, it'll be an electric vehicle, notwithstanding the need to reduce distance travelled and also to ensure the efficiency of the use of those vehicles. So therefore, as well as that technology rollout, a whole range of standards will be critical in driving products and driving and reducing the impacts of key products over time and buildings and vehicles. And I think we have a better history in the EU, in Europe, of setting standards which are met and actually delivering on them, as opposed to something like the EU ETS, which was such a ridiculous way to go about delivering that scale of reduction. Finally, financial incentives will play a key role. So this is not pretending that economics doesn't count and we can't use tools to help, in essence, guide consumption in certain directions. So it does have a role, but it is not the complete answer. Just a few further reflections on, I suppose, the system transformation and change. And one is obviously changing the whole system, both electrification and also the rollout of public transport, but also lower energy materials. So it is this kind of collection, and it's also to try and ensure that we incentivise what we want and disincentivise what we don't want. And I think what we're trying to do, or what I suppose the government would like to happen, is that one new paradigm gradually grows, the other fades away, and this happens without having to be disrupted in the system. Now, if we started this 60 years earlier, maybe we could rely on such an idea. But now we've reached a point where more disruptive change is needed, and that we won't drive the innovation in these new technologies without foreclosing the options of the ones that we don't want anymore. And that comes down to everything from subsidies, that comes down from everything from ensuring policy alignment across all areas, not having one policy area around growth, which potentially suggests that, well, we can have a bit of bad growth, and as long as we're doing lots of good things at the same time. An example of that is I gave evidence to the public inquiry against the Cumbrian coal mine. And there was an example where the actual evidence was completely ignored. And they came to the conclusion that the coal mine had no responsibility for any of the emissions that happened downstream because they couldn't be predicted because they might be sent to a steel plant that has CCS. Now, it's complete fallacy, it's complete nonsense, and I think that's an example of alignment and showing that we, in essence, disincentivize options to drive innovation in what we want. We know that there'll be a rapid skills shortage in all this, and there's people in the room who've done a lot more work on this than me, so we're not going to pretend to know a lot about it, but there's clearly a need to retrain and also to repurpose and to in essence, design a system which benefits everyone and is distributionally or spatially, the benefit is spatially distributed across the UK. But to me, that isn't a don't do this. It's simply an important point that we can't ignore. And finally, we have to accept that consumption in some areas might actually be wrong and that not all consumption is good consumption. This might even mean targeting some of the most excessive consumption, not because it is where we'll get the biggest energy demands, because it's usually done by a fairly small group, but to, in essence, send out the signal that this is a fair transition. So we might not get a massive reduction from reducing all the benefits of private jets. We will get some, but if rate their use of aviation, that in essence does not create the kind of language that we'll need to achieve this. And finally, I think to recognise that energy policy isn't really energy policy, it's about how energy is integrated into all policy areas. And it's about how energy is considered within mobility, within housing, within industry, within industrial strategy, employment policy, and everything that goes with it. To try and deal with it in isolation leads to almost the belief that a technological solution will emerge, as opposed to recognising it as a broader agenda on how we live. So just some final couple of things of where we're going forward with this. So one, obviously, we think it's essential, for a number of key reasons, but also then we're actually suggesting that discussions that the UK needs a proper energy demand target. Now, it has got some targets around electricity now, but energy isn't just electricity. We need reduction targets over time in the UK, similar to targets that we have, for example, in the rollout of renewables. And this is, in essence, a short-term programme to deal with immediate issues of cost of living, the medium one to deliver those reductions at speed, the long-term one to make sure that we're hitting these reductions around the 2040, 2050 side. The other thing, I don't know why I've done this backwards, but anyway, the other element is that we still are really holding back from a clear public debate on this issue. And I'm trying to take forward a piece of work with Becky Willis of Lancaster, who's done all the work on deliberative approaches to actually take these scenarios to citizens' panels and to actually start stress testing them and allowing them to create their visions of the future to get that public debate. For some reason, I think we don't seem to want to present the trade-offs associated with energy demands and broader kind of net zero objectives. This is truly cross-departmental. It's not just the agenda of days. And in a couple of weeks' time, a report will come out from the Government Office for Science, who've worked really closely with a lot of people from CREDS to present their visions using our sort of modelling approach and all the models that we use in this. So we are really pleased that this was able to translate immediately into a government department to use as a cross project across the whole of government. And, as well as a good case impact study, this is the aim, really, and this is the objective, to try and develop tools, approaches, and frameworks that can immediately integrate into sort of policy approaches. My final comment, I suppose, on this would then be the political response to this. And however coherent this vision may be, it falls down in some places. We're not presenting this is the future, it's a future. whatever it is, we still seem to have a very major barrier to actually talk in a transparent way with government about how they're going to achieve their outcomes and their goals. And if they don't think it's energy demand, then I'd like them to tell me what the hell it is, because I really don't know. And with that, I'll stop talking. So thank you very much.
John has done a brilliant job of, I know a lot of work has been done in this room and by other things as well, but I think just bring it together in a succinct way for us all to interrogate it. I'm slightly disappointed. I know aviation wasn't covered, but there was no mention of unicorn horns or pixie dust. So without that, I don't think any policy can be complete.
No. We can supplement information in there. Yeah.
But I think my question is, I think focusing on policy delivery to me is the key. And can I just challenge everyone involved in CRES? How can you make government departments work together? How can you get DFT and BEIS to actually have a joint programme that delivers a common outcome? Is that in the hands of the academic community, or is there some intermediary that will make that work?
Yeah, I don't think CRES could do it just because in isolation, obviously, because it's not an elected democratic body to run the country. So, you know, but clearly the way that it's operated is attempting to do that and to work with parties to do it. But when you come up against some of the views of an extreme right-wing government that we have now, it's very difficult to know how sensible solutions can be discussed and included. So it can feel quite demoralising. But I think the provider of sound evidence, which I think we've done, and I think we do, but never stop there. Working with government office of science, working with bodies who do value evidence, the CCC. There are also some excellent people in BEIS and other departments who are really good at their jobs and really do take this evidence and try and push it forward. So I find that we can support civil servants just as much, who are in essence in a different way trying to challenge their leaders. We can try and articulate this in a clear way to communicate it, and I think CRES has done a decent job of doing that within the budgets that we've got. So I think it's about not stopping and not ignoring any avenue, and engaging heavily with those networks as much as you can, and then hoping when windows of opportunities emerge, whatever they might be, that we're in the position to take them. And apart from that, if you try and do more, I think it gets to be depressing.
I just remember Ed Miliband saying there has to be a public demand for this kind of change. So is there anything we can do to inform the public?
I think there is a public demand for this change. And I always find it very strange when, because again, I was in Parliament last week, and with complete confidence, there was a Lord mentioned to me, it's a shame because the public just don't want it. Now, that sentence is based on absolutely no evidence at all. And even if we presented the evidence, I think that he'd probably say exactly the same the next day. And what he really means is that his select group of friends, which he hangs out with, do not see a benefit to this individual change. But what's been shown around climate assemblies is that when we really explain these issues and we give people the information they need to make informed decisions, they totally understand this change. Now, admittedly, all the climate assemblies work didn't necessarily, also didn't necessarily lead to net zero, but it got a long way there. And that discussion could lead to further change in the future. So I think that it's a myth that there isn't public support. There are barriers, I agree, but I think that if we bring the public along with us with a clear public debate, that we'll find that the barriers are not quite as great as we might think. It depends which voices we choose to listen to, I think.
Sorry, I've been holding the questions. Can I just go to the back first of all?
Excuse me, Daniel Shaw from One-Sided Abingdon Times Noticing Centre. So I'm really interested in public action. My question is, I think I must have missed something. The government was taken to court last, found to be wanting in their Climate Change Act.
Yeah.
Somebody somewhere, actually a little bit of help from you, is preparing a strategy that would satisfy a High Court judge. So they didn't appeal it. It's a High Court judge.
Yeah.
They could have appealed it. So the High Court judge has said, you don't have a strategy that fits with your act.
They did, yeah. Yeah.
So where, did I miss it? Did it come back to court?
No, I don't know exactly where it's up to, but my understanding is that it's still the Bays to provide that strategy, but I don't know the precise date when they've got to do it. Does anyone know? You know the answer?
It's due out by the end of March. And as far as I know, Bays are expecting to produce something by the end of March, but that's literally all I know.
My guess is it'll be delayed.
You said you have friends in Bays.
We do. So the modelling team, we've engaged heavily with the modelling team on this. I think this is where there's influence sits. So the modellers are working as hard as they can. There's policy groups working as hard as they can. I think the barrier's higher up. I don't think it's the officials would be my suggestion. So I think we can only really work with the willing. You know, I can't force someone to work with us. So I suppose we support the willing with the evidence, but that doesn't remove barriers from above, would be my suggestion.
Can we move to Nick next, please? Thank you.
The National Grid did a quite a good public relations thing, asking people to reduce their demand.
Yeah.
And that was, I only saw a few interviews on a couple on trying. The people involved were very positive and talked about the money saved. If that was done a bit more often, that would be a good way to get people engaged in it, saves money and talk about, I'm sure what it was actually, it wasn't that difficult, it still was comfortable.
I suppose yes, I think it is positive, but I think it's part of the jigsaw as opposed to the whole piece. I think if we just rely on sort of that alone, we'd be in trouble, because obviously it needs where we place infrastructure investments in the future is really important. So exactly. So I think I totally agree with you. Jigsaw combined with a whole range of other instruments.
I don't know how much of that was reduced as opposed to shift.
You know, the number that was quoted, they were aiming for was something like 320, sorry, 0.320 gigawatts. But I didn't.
I've got numbers for like 100 figures.
But I think the point about a lot of that being shift rather than demand reduction, it's not paying people to reduce how much power they use totally, it's just don't do it actually now. This is when we should be turning the lights on.
The interview, we're reducing it in one room and just
Oh, brilliant.
not doing central heating. I mean, the sort of thing, I think central heating is a good word to back. Get people to think.
Sitting in one room shivering is what some of us are doing.
Sorry, I'll just go to this gentleman next.
I used to work in fusion, so sorry for that.
The fact you used to.
Makes me think of LTNs and the kind of debate, if you can call it that, like pitched battles that I've seen on the streets of Oxford. I wonder if you have any thoughts on how to kind of stop the discourse around demand reduction kind of sliding into that ugly landscape. I could imagine kind of the really angry debate around LTNs playing out across lots of these different policy interventions if it wasn't managed appropriately.
We kind of need a spotlight now with John in the spotlight.
Yeah, sure. I don't know if I'll answer how to, I don't know if I know totally how to answer how to effectively bring about social change without effect from specific kind of newspapers and media. That's always going to be a challenge. And I suppose I've been following the Oxford on a few people on Twitter on the Oxford thing. So to do with that, so I picked up a little bit on it. And I think the fact that, I know you're not the first and there are others, but the fact that Oxford seems to be pushing it faster and further than others have probably mean that this is the place where maybe you're going to be hit more than other places. And that maybe you're carving the way to make it easier and more socially acceptable in the long term. I don't know. So whether there is a way of going about it that would have made it less adversarial, I don't know. But clearly that's the kind of change when you actually look at the evidence behind it. It has numerous benefits and limited impact on other roads in the vicinity. Well, that's as far as I can understand and interpret the evidence so far. So in a way, I think it's, and one thing maybe we try to do here is we try and set the positives of our vision and focus on those as much as possible. Of course, a small number will object, but a sense of why and that positive vision is potentially the only sort of approach that we've ever used within it. Whether that's an answer or not, I don't know, but yeah.
I'm not sure how much the studies have looked about medieval cities, because I was in Cambridge last Thursday and there were just as many vocal fisticuffs going on about what's happening there. So maybe this thing about displacing traffic can apply to a bigger city, but
Oh, that's to do with the congestion charge.
Sorry, lady at the back, and I'll continue.
Last point. Big question about public communications and engagement is actually much bigger deal. I've only very recently become aware, but I'm talking to a taxi driver in Colombia, the guinea pig letters that a lot of us got in Oxford, comments in the and comment sections on the FT. There is this shockingly pervasive conspiracy theory in circulation. It's called the Agenda 2030 conspiracy, and people are lumping together climate change, COVID, population reductions, Davos. It's a very consistent story that is coming through.
We can also pick out 5G masts, contrails. Remember, they're injecting things into the atmosphere.
There is a lot of debate, I think, going on that a lot of us. I hadn't come across it at all until this guy started talking to me, and I noticed it in all sorts of places. So I think engaging with the positive pictures of change and social media stuff is going to be really important.
Yeah, the thing I'd say to that is that they've always been there, but now they're more linked up, aren't they? I still, maybe I'm wrong, I still think they're a fairly small percentage, because when we look at the survey, really proper sizable surveys with decent sample sizes that are taking it into account, we've actually get quite positive results on change. So it really comes down to which voices government are willing to listen to, I think could be it. And so therefore, maybe these positive visions of change are about persuading politicians to listen to the right voices just as much as trying to get other people to see what's possible, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay, the next question here.
Yeah, thanks ever so much, John. That was great. Yeah, I just a comment and then a question. So on your point at the end about a public debate and the work you want to do with Becky Willis, I really underline that. Like, as you know, I work on public perceptions of removals. Everyone I work with is crying out for some proper public analysis and also debate about exactly the kind of trade-offs that you're talking about. So there's definitely demand for that from a completely different audience, which is from the removal sector, because we're very, very aware that we can't do this without understanding how people make those trade-offs, right? But yeah, my question was just about a comment you kind of made earlier in the thing about how you didn't include certain things because of cost, and I just wondered whether you did a cost analysis and what that's kind of looking at. Do you know what I mean? Is this a net cost, or is it a net economic benefit, or where is it?
So no, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what I did take out the cost actually. I'm not too sure. We didn't do a cost analysis.
Yeah,
no.
okay.
So we didn't go down that route. And we've got on our list, it's an interesting one. So we've got on our list to take forward to do a complete sort of using sort of econometric approaches to understand where this might end up in 2050 from an economy perspective. But I've become so scattered. I've done my fair share on the economic modelling side, and I'm becoming increasingly sceptical of our ability to say at all what any economy would look like in 2050. So I almost don't want to do the analysis to pretend that I do know what it is, but I also do want to do it because then you can speak the language to people and say, oh, don't worry, it won't touch the economy. So we didn't really leave things out associated with costs. And I don't know politically whether you should try and play the game with them or tell them that that's the wrong game, we shouldn't be playing it at all. And I can't quite work it out. But my sense is that there are so much possibilities here for new industrial sectors, new opportunities and skills, and in essence organising an economy in a different way. And then I suppose the other thing we deliberately left out was we didn't leave out alternative, I suppose, visions of economic futures.
Yeah.
But everyone, obviously at Leeds, there's a major degrowth, post-growth group there. And they've all said, you're sort of describing a post-growth future, but you're not saying it. You need to say it. And I was saying, I don't know, actually. I'm not sure whether we need to say it. I think we need to show how it can happen. And that's kind of the route I've gone down, and avoided naming our colours to a particular sort of economic future.
Just to flag the bit that I picked up,
Yeah.
is where you were kind of like, we didn't include direct air capture because of the cost.
Oh, sorry, yes, no, I'm with you now.
Numbers behind
Oh,
that.
right, okay. I think it was that came from Times, so that was the
Yeah,
Times bit.
okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So
I'm with you.
that's whatever price that's to kick in at. They then have this function in Times, which basically is a backstop function.
Yes,
It kicks in at some cost, it's something like £300 a ton or something. And so you can either let that kick in, or you can say no, that's not going to.
yeah.
And so that's where the cost kicks in with the kind of the Times bit. Yeah.
John, I promise.
I was just going to say, of course, it's not going to trash the economy. I mean, Stern said 1 to 2% of GDP, which has been a fairly consistent number.
Yeah.
That's about the same impact as the kind of oil price fluctuations that we had in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Didn't bring the world to an end. But what I wanted to know first was just again, it's I think relevant to what you just said. Reporting a little known fact. In November of 2021, and I think it's no coincidence that we were hosting COP26 at that time, the Treasury raised its guideline valuation of CO2 emissions from something fairly ordinary, like £50 a tonne or whatever, to £250 a tonne, which is a sort of a commensurate order with the sort of costs that people are talking about for direct air carbon capture. So,
Yeah.
and I think that's very significant. I mean, and that ought to be something that how well they do it. The other thing I wanted to say, a very, very strong point I think you made early on about early reductions being better. Well, of course they're better because the emissions stay around forever. So the further we can postpone them, the better. But there are a few sort of low-hanging fruit that people occasionally pick up on, but nobody does anything. And one would be cryptocurrencies.
Yeah.
Yet we have a prime minister who seems to think that we could make the UK the hub for cryptocurrency. And that's a carbon emission about equivalent to a country the size of Sweden.
Yeah, I think that's consistent with the idea of basically closing the options that we don't want to have. I think, yeah, we've got really good examples of something.
So now a few lots of runs. I mean, road pricing. Congestion pricing.
Yeah, so, I agree.
Just going to check if there's anyone else who hasn't asked a question yet who would like to. Not seeing any, so we'll come back to you. That's fine.
Forgive me, I'm not a kind of energy policy scholar, so I don't know if it's a silly question, but with the kind of energy efficiency measures, is it the case, or is there evidence to suggest that increased efficiency in various technologies does give you a demand reduction, or do you get a rebound?
So we published a paper on this actually, and rebound is a very complex term that can combine many different things. I suppose there's the rebound in terms of a low income family, they take some efficiency benefit and comfort, which I suppose is a good rebound. So that's just important that you know what your energy demand reduction will be and to expect that. There's, I suppose, rebounds where they switch from one consumption item to another. So they're say from heating to go on a flight or something. And that's varied across studies, anywhere between 20-30% is usually the figure that comes up. And then there's a really complex side of it, which is the indirect rebound effects associated with increases in production efficiencies through the economy, which then drive the economy forward. And that, in essence, is energy as a factor of production within the economic system. And within that context, there is quite considerable rebound effects. But that doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be bad, because in essence, if you have an energy demand target as such, and you try to achieve that, those rebounds just increase the efficiencies and the growth that you stick to your target, and you keep going, which then moderates those rebounds over time. So the other thing I think is important is the energy demand at the beginning. You might get rebounds, but at a later stage, we hopefully will have so much renewable energy on the grid that it become less important over time as well. So they are there, they are important to measure, so we have realistic pathways, but I don't think they're the thing that's going to actually stop us achieving the goals. I think is where I sit on it anyway. Yeah.
Daniel, you want to come back in?
Just, I also read the Saturday Guardian, 60 people. I can't quite remember the question. Something about what would you do with an afternoon if you're entirely free with everything. And out of the 60, only one person wasn't carbon. That was the person who wanted to laze in a warm bath. All the others had chosen activities which were carbon free. And that was a free choice of what they wanted to do. And there were other surveys of that, what are the best things in life. And almost all of them, but few people do want to go abroad. Almost all of them are carbon. So you could be quite optimistic about the quality of life in a low carbon or zero carbon life.
I was going to say that's almost in contradiction to what Phil found, that people were enjoying themselves when they were using energy in these studies. Is that not right, Phil?
Oh, no, so it's a broad range of things. Some of the least enjoyable things, like John said, people don't like to drive distance to work, and they'd much rather not do that. So there are a lot of benefits to using less unwanted energy. And some of the most enjoyable things are to be very low carbon, just like you said. Reading, sleeping, socialising, were sort of top end enjoyable low energy.
Yeah.
But if there are no more questions, you can obviously speak to John if you stand in front of the door, stop escaping. So let's thank John once again for